Hello and welcome to the CSN3M Mindset Monday podcast. I am Andrew Wade with Case Specific Nutrition. On this channel, we focus on the 3 M's: mindsets, myth busting, and mentoring, all as they pertain to health and nutrition. This podcast is brought to you by Case Specific Meal Prep, Pittsburgh's greatest meal prep and delivery service. Check them out at csmpgh.com. Get your meals ordered by Thursdays at noon, and we'll deliver contactless, fresh, prepared meals to your door that Sunday for your week ahead. Before we dig into our podcast today, please subscribe to our channel and share today's episode on your favorite social media. Help us spread the health by tagging or sharing with a friend or loved one so they can benefit too. Don't forget to do your part. Hashtag spread the health. For more content with Case Specific Nutrition, you can follow us on CSN or Case Specific Nutrition on all social media, as well as casespecificnutrition.com. On today's episode, we are going to be discussing stress and the physiology of stress. And for that, I have brought in one of our internal experts in health and wellness, Laine Greenawalt. Laine, thanks for joining us.
Hi, all.
You guys might have, for those that have listened to the podcast and listened to season 1, Laine was on in season 1 with me. We discussed the growth mindset and some of the concepts of the book, Mindset by Carol Dweck, and how you can use that to fortify your life and habits and develop a state of mind that becomes much more positive and empowering instead of critical and deleterious. And so Laine and I, we have a lot of really fun overlap. Laine is actually the longest standing full-time dietitian within the Case Specific family, beyond Allison and myself and some of our contract team members. She's been putting up with me now for about 4 years, which is pretty crazy to say.
Yeah.
But Laine and I have always kind of prided ourselves on being the physiology nerds of the group. We have the tendency to be the ones that are really investigating the labs and sort of the emerging trends in the world of the body and how it operates. And this is a very exciting time for our brains because so much of that is just starting to be really understood, whether it be how our body utilizes and metabolizes fat and energy based on all of the different genetic and environmental signals, all the way to what labs are available that we can see to be, get a better idea of what's actually going on. And so what I'm most excited about is recently Laine did a training, and it really focused on hormones and really pathways related to stress. And I'm going to let her elaborate more. But from this training, we were able to have some great conversations back and forth and then amongst the team. And it really took us to a place where we realized one of the things we wanted to try and communicate to people is that stress levels and the appropriate balance of stress in your life and how stress affects your life psychologically, physically, emotionally, is something that tends to be really low on the totem pole when it comes to health and well-being. It's the one that we kind of defer. There's cultural influence to that. There's a lot of different things that the reasons that happens. But we want to really make sure we speak today to the importance of understanding it. And I'm hoping that when you get done listening to this podcast today, you're going to be reassessing how much of a priority it should be to really better understand and take inventory of your stress, how it's affecting you, and how it might be affecting you in ways you didn't realize. So without further ado and further ramblings on my end, Laine, tell us a little bit about the training you did, and then let's dig into some of the meat. What were some of the big takeaways we want to make sure people understand?
Sure. Yeah, I did a 8-week intensive course. It was focused around functional medicine. So we really dug into the nitty gritty of hormones, all pathways of the body, right? Stress being one of them, with the overarching concept being that hormones are a symphony, right? And so all of these symptoms in our body work as a network of messengers. And when one is out of balance, it can have a great effect on some of the other systems. And so, learning about stress hormones and how it affects other pathways in the body has allowed me to help my clients more effectively because I now see them as a whole system rather than these individual siloed lab values or symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. So. And it's said simply, right, is at the end of the day, how many people out there listening have themselves or know someone that, focuses in on, eating well and moving well. And, these two, diet and exercise habits that we get pounded to death with in the modern world, and are disappointed when their body doesn't seem to be responding.
Sure.
Right. And then immediately they say, oh, well, maybe it's my thyroid, or maybe it's this, or maybe it's this. And the reality is, in many of those cases, it probably is something within that stress related hormonal axis that I'm going to let you describe a little further, that's actually got a grip or a hold on the body and is giving it some signaling. And so do you want to maybe walk people through sort of that axis a little bit, and how it's, where it sort of reaches and how it can sort of affect things?
Yeah. So when we talk about stress response in the body, it works within a system called the HPA axis, which is your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so what that means is that your brain, your adrenal glands, your thyroid, all of these things are connected in a negative feedback loop. And so when we send signals or chemical messengers to the body that there is stress, it starts to have a down chain effect on some of those other hormones. So what might be presenting as a thyroid issue could have started as a stress issue. And so, what we're really going to dig in today is just, like Andrew said, the physiology of stress, what's happening in the body during a stress response, and how that can affect not only your weight loss or body composition goals, but other things as well. Andrew and I were talking before we started recording, and when we talk about diet and exercise, for most of us, a lot of time the goal is weight loss, right? Or body composition changes. And I think that, it's important to understand that how stress can affect your body's ability to achieve those changes. If the goal is to create a calorie deficit, hormones can greatly affect your ability to create a calorie deficit, whether that's through cravings or behaviors, or whether that's simply a metabolic shift where your body's not going to use the fuel you're giving it as effectively as it should. And so it's really a foundational thing. And I'm sure my clients get tired of me talking about it, but like sleep and stress all the time, because it doesn't matter how good your diet and exercise program are. If you're not doing these things, you're probably not going to get as far as you would like to.
Yeah, absolutely. And said another way, that's another reason to take inventory and ask, are your diet and exercise stress relieving or stress causing? Because how many people are, have these bodies that are stressed from work and life demands, and, the constant drive and drain, and, all of that. And then they force themselves to exercise in a way that they don't enjoy. And they force themselves to eat in a way that they don't enjoy. They follow some extremely rigid fat approach, which makes it even more stressful. So now you're forcing these habits that are causing stress on top of stress. And then you're frustrated and annoyed when things don't work. And the reality is, diet and exercise are meant to be the things that can actually bust stress and have balance, right? Yeah. Lunch can either be an inconvenience, or it can be a really, really good pause in the day, right? Dinner can either be this scrambling last minute at the end of the night when you're hungry and moody and irritable and tired and dealing with family, or it can be a chance to wind down and actually appreciate the reason that you work so hard in the first place. Yeah. Exercise can either be that thing that eats up an hour of your day, or it can be the excuse to get away and be a little bit selfish. And so stress is, in many ways, right? And this is something I think you and I talked about that we want to really dig into as well, is that stress is something that is part physiologic and also part perspective. So there's one hand, which is like, how is it physically affecting you? And then on the other is, how is it mentally affecting you? And I know for me, when I work a lot, particularly with like a lot of the service workers and things in the area, there's this big disconnect between what is mental stress and physical stress, which is to say that idea. And I know I'm guilty of this. I know that, little secret about me, I'm very anxiety and panic driven. And about 4 years ago, I was working way too much. I mean, 18 hours, a lot of days of the week, putting in 90, 100 hours a week, trying to get this business off the ground, being, in that mode. And mentally, I was thriving because I was on a mission. I was feeling accomplished, but I started getting panic attacks and heart palpitations. And I remember talking on the phone with Allison at one point, and I'm driving home and I'm just like frustrated. I'm like, I don't have time for this BS. This anxiety is just like, I can't deal with this right now. This is stupid. These heart palpitations are a pain in my butt. And she goes, I really don't know anybody that can work like 18 hours a day and not have a physical consequence. And it kind of, dietitian, like, light bulb where I went, what do you know? Just because I could mentally deal with the stress doesn't mean that it wasn't having a physical consequence. And so, let's talk a little bit about the physical consequences of stress. And that goes both ways, saying that
Sure.
we know that there's importance to it, but there's also damage that can come from it. So can you shed some more light on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think you touched on a really good point, and there's a really great book called "Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers," and it's on our recommended reading list on our website. And I highly, if you enjoy that kind of reading, I highly recommend you pick it up. But the idea, I think it's important for everyone to understand that stress is stress regardless of where it's coming from. So your body physiologically, hormonally is going to respond the same whether that stress is mental, like you have a work stress, relationship stress, financial stress, or physical stress like overexercise or too extreme of a calorie restriction or a nutrient poor diet or heavy metal toxicity, right? Any of these environmental factors are going to elicit a stress response from the body. And the stress response, in the most basic terms, is an alertness response. Your sympathetic nervous system is activated, right? And this is an ancestral response, right? So if you are a zebra on the savannah or wherever they live, I don't know, and there's a predator, right? Your sympathetic nervous system gets activated and you are either going to fight or you are going to flee. And at the end of that experience, either the threat is gone, right? Or you're gone.
Yeah.
Like that's it, right? So the stress is acute and temporary and it serves a purpose. It gets you out of that situation,
It's an acute
right?
intervention, right?
Right. And so this is a situation where stress is a good thing, right? That deadline at work that motivates you. You crank it out, you get it done. But then, in theory, that stress would be over and we would be able to relax and come back to baseline after that. Well,
Mhm.
what happens in our modern environment is that we never get back to baseline. It's like a bunch of chronic little tiny stressors that we don't even perceive as stressors
Mhm.
that build up and constantly keep us in this state of alertness response.
Yeah.
And what that means is when, going back to that concept where hormones are a symphony or work within a network, that means that the more that sympathetic nervous system is activated, the more resources that are being put toward that stress response, which then means that other aspects of that network are being neglected. Resources cannot be put toward
Yeah.
thyroid hormone production. They cannot be put toward hormone balance. They cannot be put toward cognition
Yeah.
and tissue recovery from injury, right? They
Yep.
can't be put toward dealing with inflammation because we are constantly in this place of stress response.
Of acute signaling. No,
Yeah.
I love that. And that's, I remember when you and I put that book on the list a couple of years back, and
Mhm.
I don't know how many clients over the years I've given the roaming the plains and getting chased by a tiger. And
Sure.
it's this simple concept of like, if you're being chased by a tiger, what's going to help you get away? And it's like, well, first your blood sugar is going to spike so that there's more sugar in the bloodstream, so that there's energy in the muscles so that you can get away.
Right.
Your heart rate, blood pressure, all of those are going to go
Yep.
up so that you can
Adrenaline.
track all of
Yeah.
that. Your adrenaline's going to pump. You're not going to be dealing with long-term goals. You're going to abandon all long-term everything, just
Yeah.
short-term. But even further, right? Like when we look at IBS in the United States, how many people say they have IBS? Well, like your digestive tract gets signaled by stress not to digest, because in reality, if you were running from a tiger, would it be useful to poop your pants? Probably not, right? And
Stop and eat.
yeah, that's exactly. You don't have time to stop and eat while you're running. And then from there, you're going to retain water, right? So that your body can stay hydrated camel style. And so you start to realize all these things are acute benefit, right? They set you up to be basically this conserved, efficient being that can get away or flee a problem. But if you're living that way for years, you're telling your metabolism to conserve. You're telling your body not to burn as efficiently. You're telling your body not to recover. You're saying defer all of this. It's going to have long-term consequences. And you and I have seen hundreds of people over the last few years that is the reality, right? They come in and they're ready to work on their diet and their exercise, but when we start to talk through stress, it's too low on the totem pole. They say that's not something I can affect or something I can change. And at what point do we call out the attention that being lighter, if weight loss is something that actually would improve an individual's health, right? It comes from being a healthier version of you. And yes, eating well and moving well can be assets, especially if you're moving in a way you enjoy, and especially if you're eating in a way you enjoy. But the reality is that if the stress is the thing that's been holding you back, one might argue that stress is the thing that you need to put the most effort into to actually create the healthier you in the first place.
Yeah.
And once again, I know that you, and I know you'll vouch for this, the clients over the years that I've seen that have the most success with their goals and then have the most sustained success are the ones that figure out that it's not diet and exercise for the purpose of scale manipulation, right? It's integrating movement into your life that, again, pokes holes in your day and allows for stress to go down and allows for yourself to have a little bit of mental time. It's eating in a way that is food both as delicious and nutritious, so that the meals are, once again, breaks in your day. They're attentive to you. They're a little bit selfish. And those things set it up so now an individual's, yes, they're paying attention to how they eat and move, but they're doing it in a way that's stress relieving instead of stress adding. So now all of a sudden their stress levels come down. And that's where we get into sort of what we call the permission to change, right? Which, because the body finally reduces its short-term stranglehold and says, hey, okay, let's go ahead and change because we are safe right now.
Yeah, I think, and this is, I'm sure we'll get into this more later, but a really quick activity that you can do, like if you're listening to this and you're like, like some of this is resonating and you're starting to question where are my priorities at,
There is stress in your life.
Draw 2 columns get a blank piece of paper, cut it in half, right? On one side, I want you to list all the things that charge you, that give you energy, that relieve your stress, that, are restorative, right? It could be, I don't care if it's a hot cup of tea at the end of the day, whatever it is, small, large, doesn't matter, right? And then on the opposite side of that, I want you to draw out everything that you would consider a drain, things that pull energy, things that bring your mood down, things that require more of you than give, okay? And I want you to look at those lists, and I want you to, it's like visually, it'll be really obvious where you stand, right? If your drains list is twice as long as your charges list, you're out of whack.
Yep.
Period. Right.
Exactly.
And we got to start looking at ways where we can start balancing that scale, whether it's adding things that charge us or removing things that drain us. That might be relationships, that might be activities that we think we enjoy, but we're not doing it for the right reasons. Mm-hmm. That might be being hyper aware of what we're eating.
Yeah.
So, but you gotta, I think it's helpful visually. I'm a very visual learner, so it helps, to kind of, to break
absolutely that. To see that. And like you said, once you see it, it's organized and you'll start to see that game of tug of war, right? The world that we live in where things are pulling you different directions. And when that's out of balance, that's going to tell us that there's signaling going on. Yeah. So I think one of the things that might be helpful for us to dig into is sort of what we'll call that adrenal sort of shutdown process that takes place, right? Where we just kind of went through and dug into cortisol, gives you this, is the, sort of main hormone that we hear about that is a part of that fight or flight response. And as you said, we need cortisol. Cortisol is not a bad thing. The goal isn't to go to zero with it, but we know that it can also go the other way and it can be sort of too present. And so can you walk people through the phases that occur when someone goes from sort of this short-term fight or flight response that has some value in our life to then, when it's prolonged and extended, some of the ripples and effects it has down the lane?
Sure. So yeah, like you mentioned, I think cortisol plays a really important role in the body, like insulin, like sodium, like carbohydrates. Maybe I think that cortisol tends to get a bad rap.
The thing you're not supposed to have any of.
Yeah, none. Yeah. I don't want it. It's bad. But I think going back to that concept of hormones being a symphony or an orchestra, it has a role to play. And so none is not good.
Not to interrupt, but just like all those others, right? When we talk about sodium and carbs and insulin and all of the things that tend to be researched, right? Those are all things that we need, all of them. They're supposed to have value, but we're seeing a large population having dysfunction in them. And that's where the manipulation, but our society loves to talk about elimination instead of moderation. So anyway,
Sure.
so cortisol moderation, I like the concept.
Yeah, cortisol moderation, exactly. Yeah, so cortisol is if you're looking at a lab test, whether it's a blood or like a Dutch test or a salivary cortisol test, that is probably the first marker that we're going to start looking at in terms of the stress response in the body. And you've probably heard the term adrenal fatigue thrown around. I don't really like that term. I think it's physiologically inaccurate, kind of like leaky gut is also physiologically inaccurate.
It's trendy.
Right. Yeah. It's buzzworthy, but it's not true in a
Yeah.
physiologic sense. And so I would rather refer to it as adrenal adaptation, right? Because what your hormones do is respond to the environment that you give it, right? They are trying to maintain homeostasis. They are trying to maintain balance in that ancestral kind of way that we talked about, based on the inputs that you're giving it. If that's calorie restriction, over exercise, lack of sleep, constant worrying, whatever that is, your hormones are responding to that. And cortisol is that main stress response hormone. So adrenal adaptation can really simply be broken out into 3 stages. The first one is that acute stress response, like we talked about, where cortisol goes up, right? And we see an elevated alertness response. That's beneficial. It gets us out of a bad situation potentially. Well, if we see that stress response continue in a chronic situation, we then enter stage 2, which would be considered compensatory. So we see cortisol is no longer elevated. So cortisol's gone up, and it's dropped back down to what we would consider like a normal cortisol level. But what we're also looking for at this stage would be DHEA to drop off. So DHEA is produced in the same part of your adrenal gland as cortisol. So if we're constantly having to pump out cortisol, remember that sharing of resources conversation, DHEA production is now pushed down, right? It's suppressed because our body is putting all this effort toward making cortisol and not as much toward making DHEA. Why is DHEA important? Well, it's a precursor to cholesterol, all your cholesterol-based and steroid-based hormones, estrogen, testosterone, things like that. So, we now have normal cortisol, but a lower than normal DHEA or suboptimal DHEA. And then stage 3 would be like, okay, we've been in this chronic overexertion stress.
Running from that tiger for a long time.
Yeah. And this isn't a matter of weeks, that we're talking like
years,
months to years of chronic stress that we're not dealing with
and
no
to be
breaks.
fair, it probably varies based on the level of stress as well and how
Yes,
you're
and I think
dealing with it.
A certain level of individual resiliency. How you respond to that stress, what your diet, what your other environmental factors look like. Like if you have a nutrient poor diet and we're under chronic stress, your body's going to run out of these resources much faster than somebody who's eating a very balanced diet and dealing with the same level of stress. Or somebody who also practices meditation daily and is dealing with the same level of stress. Andrew's shared his personal story. I am currently going through my own health journey, where I am I'm working with a practitioner, and I had this inflammation level. He's like, this is the top 5 highest inflammation marker I've seen out of anyone I've seen. And I was like, oh, really? He's like, yeah, typically people have way more symptoms than you. And I was like, oh, well, okay. He's like, it's probably the fact that you're doing all these other things well that is preventing you from having more severe symptoms.
Preventing this from being a problem.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, but stage 3 would be considered exhaustion, right? So now we see cortisol's in the toilet, DHEA's in the toilet. We feel like crap. We have no energy. We're not sleeping well. We are, fatigue, pain, muscle weakness. Our blood pressure might drop. We might be experiencing hypoglycemia or lightheadedness, anxiety and depression, brain fog. We see salt cravings. I think going back to that low sodium conversation, salt is super important for adrenal function. Thyroid and libido drop off, all kinds of things drop off. So when we end up to the point where we have maxed out our body's ability to produce cortisol, this is where we start seeing these chronic fatigue symptoms.
Everything else gets depleted. And again, that's going to affect metabolism and all sorts of things, which means the body's going to not be getting the same signaling responses from the external stuff that we're telling it, right? The way you're feeding yourself, the way you're moving, all of those external signals get blunted because the internal is just exhausted.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, right, I think that if we stop here for a second and say, wow, okay, stress levels are really, really complex and comprehensive and extremely vital in your overall wellness journey, right? And I think that when you and I started this, we said we wanted to do this podcast because that was sort of our identification is most people have managing stress as like almost like an asterisk bonus at the
If
bottom
I
of
have
their
time.
ambition. If I have time, right? Which is a stressed comment. And
Yeah.
it's just to say that the goal isn't to have no stress. That's not realistic. And to be fair, that's also not healthy. Our body does benefit a little bit from stress, right? It's we'll call it it challenges the body just enough to stay relevant, so to
Yeah.
speak. But it all goes back to
Training
trying
would
to
call that progressive overload.
yeah, it's no different than training your muscles,
Yep.
or training anything else, right? If your body is given some level of stress or overload, it's going to respond favorably. But we're talking about unmanaged constant stress that's again probably not on the forefront of the mind and is just being dealt with. And again, it becomes the main barrier or the main obstacle. And so it's funny because you get all these people that they want to change their health and they're okay, I'm willing to do this ridiculously extreme and rigid fad approach to eating and moving, and I'm willing to sacrifice these hours doing a workout I don't fully love, and I'm willing to eat next to nothing compared to my list of favorite and preferred foods. I'm willing to do all these things, but I'm not willing to change my stress. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
wait a second, if you're willing to make all these other manipulations, let's consider this. Let's think about, okay, what if the change that you make in your stress is the key to it all? What if it allowed you to eat more of your favorite foods? What if it allowed you to move less or move in a way that's more enjoyable for you? What if that was the thing that unlocked it all? Wouldn't it be worth doing?
And I think that I always tie this back to, blue zones or centrogenarian cultures where they have a large percentage of the population lives to be, 90, 100 or more.
Mm-hmm.
And with like a health quality that's higher, right?
Yeah.
And one of the, there's been so much research done on these cultures, and they've looked at diet and they looked at exercise and they looked at all these things, and there's nothing is the same except how these people interact with their community and how they deal with stress.
Yeah.
The fact that they slow down, the fact that they aren't rushing from place to place. I mean, siestas in Spain, right?
Yeah.
Or,
It's
just the pace
fascinating,
of
right?
culture, right? And so like if we're looking at stress as being a foundational part of health, I think that that's a prime example, right? These people don't have this, like they're not rushing, they're not like us, that sleep when I'm dead mentality, right? Like
Exactly.
that's, the grind, the hustle, like we've been told that that's the way we should be living, but is it really work? Like what is it costing us, and is it worth it?
Absolutely. It's as you know, and as a lot of people that I work with know, like I've traveled quite a bit. I've been to 50 countries so far. And it's fascinating because you realize that our American culture is definitely that of stress and pressure, right? This is the only place in the world that people brag how long it's been since they took a vacation, or even boastfully state that they don't take a lunch, they work through lunch, and they have a sense of pride from it. As a society, we work on average 15 hours more a week than most other first world countries.
Yep.
And what's terrifying is we aren't proportionately more productive. When you compare like GDP to population to hours spent, we don't make, we're working, we'll say on average 20% more, but we don't make 20% more by comparison. And
Right.
you start to realize that the stress level really doesn't give us any advantage. There's a sense of pride in work, and that's fantastic. I mean, I'd be a hypocrite not to say I don't get pride in what I do. I'm definitely somebody that works a lot and gets a lot of value out of that. But it's to say that, like you said, when we look at hypothyroidism and autoimmune disorders
IBS.
and IBS and a lot of these diseases that don't really exist in other places. And it's easy to say, oh, well, they're just not testing for them there. No, we're talking about the other developed nations that have strong workforces and vibrant economies and very similar ways of life day to day to us. They are doing things differently, and it's hard not to acknowledge that yes, we as a nation, we tend to eat lower quality food. As a nation, we tend to be less active. And both of those things probably contribute to stress levels going up instead of going down. But it's to note that stress is that common denominator that we see in our nation that plagues and is becoming that speculation of why we have a lot of these issues. Where when you go to Spain and you have people take a siesta in the afternoon, or you go to the Netherlands and you note that people work 6 hours a day and leave work at work with them and then go spend the evening being social with family and friends. And when you recognize the notion of the elevator pitch, which is if someone asks me, tell me about yourself in 30 seconds, one of the first few things is going to probably be what I do for a living, right? I'm probably going to identify, I'm married, I have, a wife and dogs. And then the next thing is going to be, I own a private practice and I'm a dietitian and this is what I do. Where if you go to the Netherlands, if you ask someone 30 seconds, tell me about yourself, they probably won't even mention what they do for a living.
Yeah.
And it's not that we need to change that intent entirely. It's just to be aware of it because
sure. Yeah.
it definitely contributes. And when we're sitting here watching our, these last few generations in particular, be overwhelmingly sick and have these new diseases and issues that it's not a result of, oh, we're the only ones diagnosing it. It's we're the ones seeing it in mass quantity. And it's because of something that we are doing. And it's likely a culmination of multiple things we are doing in our life.
And like you said, the goal here, I think, I'm a huge fan of the rise of, mindfulness culture and the awareness that has been brought to the benefits of things like mindful meditation and, mental self-care. I think it's hugely valuable, but I think that the message gets twisted from time to time. And I think that we get the impression that we should, one, always be happy, thanks social media, two, that we should have no stress. And that's unrealistic, right? That's not reality at all. And so, the goal is not to not have stress. The goal is to recognize when you have stress and be able to respond to it in a way that's constructive.
Yeah.
Right.
Learning to lean into it.
Right. Recognize okay, this is a situation where, it's a stressful situation. Here's how I'm going to get through it. Here's how I'm going to make it better. And then when it's over, let it be over.
Yeah.
Or have enough of those charges in that column to make sure that you can balance it out.
Exactly. So you can absorb the stress and again, put it to good use. And that's
Right.
been, I'll open up and note, like I said, about 4 or 5 years ago, I was definitely knocked out of balance. And there was some 25-year-old, 24-year-old insecurities that were at play there that we don't have time to dig into a psychology podcast on top of a stress and adrenal scenario. But I will say that, fast forward now, that's probably been one of the biggest changes in my personal life is I definitely have found ways to balance things out better. And as a result, it's not to say that I work. I mean, I do work less, but I still work a lot. I still have a pretty demanding schedule. Most of the team within Case Specific joke and tease and talk about how my calendar looks like an anxiety attack. But it's just to say that I've figured out ways to support it so that it flows well and it actually supports me. Mm-hmm. And so the goal isn't to have zero stress. It's to be able to own your stress and have those resources in mind when you get knocked out of balance. Because it's never going to be, every couple months, at least once or twice a year, I usually have to recalibrate, redraw some lines. And,
but that's like you take 2 weeks out of the year and go vacation.
That's why I've been to 50 countries. Right? Exactly.
Yep. That's, you work for 7 months like a crazy person, and then you go away for 14 days.
And that's part of, people laugh because I go to all these like crazy, I'm on Kilimanjaro and I'm in the Galapagos Islands and I'm in the Amazon. It's because I can't work there, right? Like I get myself
without internet.
Yeah, I literally go somewhere where it's like, oh, that's not an option. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm stuck with writing in a journal for the next couple of weeks. And
right.
It's extremely
just to circle back, I think that, one of the things in terms of physiology, talking about cortisol and how it affects our behavior, right? So going back to the concept of creating a calorie deficit, well, if you're constantly craving carbohydrates because your cortisol is constantly through the roof, guess what? It's going to be hard to stick to that super restricted diet or that calorie deficit because you're not managing the stress. So now we're having a conversation where hormones are impeding your ability to stick to that positive diet change that you're trying to make.
Exactly.
So what's the first domino, right? Is it the calories, or is it what's causing you to overeat in the first place?
Exactly. And it's that most people, it's starting to become a little more common knowledge, but that reality that like our metabolism isn't a set number. It's not set in stone.
No.
That's why calories in, calories out is a concept, but it's not all
Right.
knowing and constantly correct. There's a lot of people that it doesn't work for. It's because the reality is calories out can vary. Your body can put you in power save mode. And the reality is if you're already stressed and then you do decide to create some sort of intentional deficit, that's an additional stress in certain ways, which means
Oh,
your
and
body
your HIIT workout 6 days a week?
yeah, exactly. So you're
Yeah.
under eating, over moving, and those two things, instead of being stress relieving, are now stress adding. And so your body's getting even more signals to shut down, conserve, batten down the hatches, go into survival mode. And that's where, when we step back and come full circle, we go, okay, where is stress as you take inventory on your health journey? Where is stress in your priorities? And also, where is stress in your, on the side of how it's actually affecting you?
Yeah.
And from there, are your lifestyle habits, how you move, how you eat, the plans you're making, are they drains or are they charges? Because
Yeah.
the reality is, if they are drains, something is wrong, right? They need to be charges. And the secret to lifestyle balance is recognizing that people that eat well and move well and enjoy those things, the enjoyment, the stress relieving aspect, is what really creates the outcome. And again, gets you on that path to load up your charges and deplete your drains and get your body on a path to recovery with stress. And I know you and I have both seen this, but when someone's been in this state of shutdown and has had that, sort of stress related exhaustion, and we start to get them to prioritize habits appropriately and start to make space for themselves. And that may look like some activity, that may look like some good eating, that may look like some intentional mindfulness, some ways to get away, whatever it is. It still takes time for the body to unravel all these hormonal signals it's been having for years. And so it comes back to, this isn't something that you do it for 2 weeks and then get frustrated because it didn't work. This is something that you have to accept as a new intervention of lifestyle and being the healthier you. Let it happen, let it take its effect, and be patient with it, because it's going to unravel gradually and it's going to get better and better and better. But it's not this instant quick fix. And to be honest, that's why you and I aren't billionaires, right? It's because we aren't selling the quick fix. We are selling the legitimate solutions to actual problems.
Well, that takes work.
It does. It does. But we're here to help with it, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the fun part.
Question for you.
Yeah.
If you had to pick one lifestyle toggle, we'll call it, to help people manage their stress or their cortisol response, what would you pick? I know what mine would be.
That's a really good one. I feel like, honestly, I think my number one would be enjoying lunch.
Okay. That's a good one.
Like, and what I mean is like liking the taste of it, taking the time to be present for it, like literally like enjoying lunch, because I think that is a middle of the day where people's stress is rising. And if they skip through lunch, it goes like this. But if they pause, it drains it back down and it resets. And I think that it becomes the meal that saves you mentally for when you get to dinner. And I think it makes the evenings better. And I think you're less likely to scroll on your phone and be drained and beat up. And I think it makes your evenings more likely to be enjoyable or productive. So I think it's the domino in my mind. What about you?
I like that one. I love the concept of getting sunlight in your eyeballs early in the day.
Ooh, sunlight in the eyeballs. I love that.
So if we're talking about, circadian rhythm, right? And, our body clock responding to light, getting outside, getting some sunlight early in the day can really help with that circadian rhythm, which then will improve sleep and stress resiliency and all of that.
It gets all those things in motion. So there you go. 2 habits from two people that have been helping people with their lifestyle for years, right? We've got, let's get some sunshine or some light early in the day. And it's worth noting for everyone in Pittsburgh, I know it's cloudy here, like 6 months out of the year, but the sun does shine through the clouds. And even though it's not as effective, it still does work. It's actually very, very valuable. Regardless, when it's cold, obviously being bundled up doesn't help the vitamin D part, but you can still get those eyeballs getting some light. So open those blinds. I know that's one of the things I do. I tend to naturally wake up a little earlier before my alarm, and I open one of the blinds, and it's before it's light out. And part of it's so the dogs can look out the window, but the other part is so that I can get a little bit of natural light in my day, because it's going to start that wake up. And then make time midday for the lunch. And if, just as a recap, Laine's thought of drains and charges, making that list, what's draining you, what's charging you, and looking at that as a game of tug of war and realizing that the game of increasing the charges, reducing the drains, or for a lot of people in the fad world, converting the drains and turning them into charges becomes one of the most impactful things you can do. And again, all you're doing, you're changing how you're signaling to your body, which changes the cascade of signals that flow through and create the overarching message. And now all of a sudden we're in a place where the body's hearing different things, being told different things, and as a result starts to respond to different things. So do your drains and charges. Keep in mind that if habits that you're doing that are meant to be positive are draining you, that is where things need to change, and you need to potentially reach out to somebody that might be able to help you brainstorm how to make them a little bit more enjoyable. And then there's some great books out there. I think that, the Zebras book, as you mentioned, is a really good one for anybody listening. Any final tips that you wanted to make sure people walk away with before we close this out and send people on their way, reprioritizing and reassessing their stress?
No, I mean, I think we touched on a lot of really good points. I think that it definitely needs to move up the totem pole, and we need to recognize that it is foundational, and it doesn't matter how good your diet and exercise are. If your body is stressed, you're not going to achieve what you're looking to achieve, most likely. Yep.
Well, thanks again for your continued education, 2, your expertise, and you as an asset to the case-specific community and family. But also, thanks for taking the time today to dig into some of the stuff you've learned and some of the things that you and I continue to, battle in our day-to-day client endeavors. And so, thanks to everybody listening. Once again, I hope you found this podcast useful. I hope you found it interesting. I hope that it was relevant to you. If there's a family member or a friend that you're thinking of during this podcast, be sure to send this to them, tag them, text it to them. And if you do a social media post, please #spread the health so that we can continue our work on spreading health amongst the community. For those of you that have been thinking about your stress levels, and lunches have been all over the place, and I don't feel like I have the mental space to prioritize them. Check out Case-Specific Meal Prep. That's why we created it, csmpgh.com. Place your orders by Thursday at noon, and those foods will be fresh made on Saturday and delivered to your house on Sunday. We have 9 different options. I know I use them as my lunch 3 days a week, which are my 3 heaviest counseling days, the days that it feels hard to pack or prep or even microwave. And I love the meals. They taste delicious. And myself and our dietitian team are working with our chef that's on staff to really create some amazing meals. So csmpgh.com as a proud sponsor of this podcast, and also an awesome asset to maybe help reduce your stress levels and improve your lunch, like I talked about. Thanks again for being part of our CSN community. We will be back next week with another CSN3M Mindset Monday podcast. And until then, be well and spread the health.